Assalamu alaikum. We will begin with lecture 29 now, and I will discuss with you another poem by Philip Larkin, that is the Whitson Weddings. And as I mentioned in the previous lecture, this is one other very famous and a very popular poem of Larkin. In this poem, we shall see that Larkin employs the same techniques and the style is the same also. The style for which he's so famous for. So the poem, once again, is in the symbolic tradition. It employs lots of traditions, yet it is colloquial. The topic is of everyday life. He offers us a description of what he observes, what he has personally experienced, like the previous poem. So very much colloquial, very much everyday kind of an event that is described here, that are the weddings, wedding parties, and the happiness associated with the occasion. Those are the themes of discussion in this poem. So once again we shall see Larkin experimenting with the theme of human relationships. He is, when he observes scenes around him, he's caught up with the idea and with the reflective mind of a poet on the relationship issues between men and women and between people. So we see that once again he takes up that theme of human relationship in this poem, but again we shall see his ambivalent self sometimes coming out and bringing out the cynicism and the skepticism that is the trademark of Larkin. So let us begin with the poem, The Whitson Weddings. Now the poem was inspired basically by a train journey which the poet made from Hull to London in 1955 on Whitsun Saturday, a day which was popular for weddings at that time. This Whitsun Saturday, it was a day which was known for weddings, and most of the common folk, they preferred to be wedded on the Whitsun Saturday. So as I told you in the opening also, that it is inspired by an actual event. The poet himself took this journey on a train while he was going from Hull to London, and in the year 1955. And on his way to London, he witnessed these wedding parties, and as before he actually gets to London, he describes these wedding parties that he observes or encounters during the journey. The poem was finally completed in October 1958, following repeated redrafting. So after repeated redrafting, it was printed in 1958. The Whitson Weddings is Larkin's longest poem, and you shall see his longest poem is also not that long, but it is his longest poem. It is narrated in a slow, unhurried, leisurely fashion which reenacts a sense of the long, easy train journey from Hull to London. Once again there is a sense that the time, he experiments with time, but once again we see that the idea of time also resonates through the verse, through the words. So all the attitude of the poet is, and the movement of the poet is unhurried, it's slow, it is leisurely. He's observing every little phenomena that he sees, and he captures it in his poem. So he is describing it in the slow, leisurely fashion, and it is done also in a slow, leisurely rhythm of the poem, as you shall see. The poem's narrator actually describes the scenery and the smells of the countryside and the towns through which the largely empty train passes. This is just a brief summary of the poem. So as the train leaves the Hull station, the poet describes to you the different scenery, but he also describes to you the smells. So you shall see that the poem is reminiscent of Keats's odes. It is reminiscent of the sensuous imagery that Keats evoked. We shall come across these senses of smell and sight most often being evoked in the poem. So the train passes through largely empty towns. The train's windows are open because of the heat, and he gradually becomes aware of the bustle on the platforms at each station, eventually realizing that this is the noise and action of wedding parties that are seeing of couples who are boarding the train. So to the senses of sight and smell, the sense of hearing is added here, is included to the poem, which and the sounds on the platforms when they reach him, when they reach the poet, he introduces another theme to the poem. The poem reflected the marriage nowadays and how they are and how some of them end. Towards the end of the poem, after he gives you the description of the journey, you shall see that the ambivalent tone is back, and the poet's cynicism and skepticism has returned, because he seems to be doubting the fidelity of human relationships. The next point says that the poetic form is quite regular, with 8 stanzas, each consisting of 10 lines and rhyming A, B, A, B, C, D, E, C, D, E, which creates the rhythmic sound of a train as it gathers speed. So again you see the rhyme, the form. It is in harmony with the structure of the poem. But you see that it consists of 8 stanzas, and each stanza consists of 10 lines, and that is why the poem is described as the longest amongst the Larkin's poems. The continuous rhyming pattern throughout the 8 verses and the pattern of unstressed and stressed syllables in each iambic pentameter reenacts the rocking sensation of the traveling on a train. Critics have discerned that the use of iambic pentameter, the lines are written in iambic pentameter, they have, all stanzas have a regular rhyme scheme. As you can see, A, B, A, B, C, D, E, C, D, E. We have a quatrain followed by a triplet and then another triplet. So the same rhyme scheme, the same rhyming pattern in all stanzas is to be found, and all stanzas then are written in iambic pentameter, which is a pattern of unstressed and then stressed syllables. And he says the same, this rhythmic pattern and this rise and fall, it is again in line, in harmony with the actual rocking sensation of the train. So the poet's manipulation of the form of the poem and his manipulation of the structure of the poem is to give it unity when it is compared to the content of the poem. So once again, the form and the structure are in harmony with the content of the poem. Let us now analyze the stanzas in the poem. Stanza 1. That Whitson, I was late getting away, then colon. So you see, if he's putting a colon at the end of the first line, it means that there is a pause, and so we need to understand the first line first before we go on to the next ideas. He says, that Whitson, I was late getting away. So that Whitson, he's talking about this special Saturday on which he went on this journey by train, but he's describing that moment when it was happening, but he uses that that word, the word that, kind of dissociating himself from the actual day, from the actual event. So that Whitson, he says, I was late getting away. He says, I had to get to the train, but I was late. Not till about 1:20 on the sunlit Saturday did my 3/4 empty train pull out. All windows down, all cushions hot, all sense of being in a hurry gone. You see, the language is colloquial. The rhythm of the lines is slow, but the description is of everyday objects, of everyday routine life, of everyday life. And he's talking in a colloquial, everyday manner, because he says it was not when the clock struck 1:20, 20 past 1 on the sunlit Saturday. So he started his journey on a Saturday afternoon, on a hot Saturday afternoon, at the peak hours of 20 past 1. And he says, did the train move out of the Hull station? And he describes the train as half empty, as more than half empty, because he says 3/4 of the train were empty. And then all windows were down. The weather was so hot that all the windows of the train, he said, were down. All cushions were also feeling hot. All sense of being in a hurry gone. He says, in that environment, all the hurry was gone now, and I was completely relaxed. So you see, the opening is conversational, yet the structure is firm, the rhythm is firm. The description, he gives you the description of the journey on this hot Saturday afternoon. The stanza continues. He says, we ran behind the backs of houses, crossed a street of blinding windscreens, smelt the fish dock, thence the river's level drifting breadth began, where sky and Lincolnshire and water meet. Now, he's describing to you how, as a train is moving forward, different scenes, the scenes change, and the train passes through different localities, different towns, and he sees different images, different scenes. So we have this sense of sight being involved here. He says, as a train ran, as a train moved. But look at the pronoun that he's used for it. He uses we. So he feels at peace with the scene now. He feels in harmony with the whole scene now. He does not dissociate himself from the scene now, here, in these lines. In the opening line, when he said that Whitson, he was dissociating himself from the scene. He was dissociating himself from that day, from that event. But now we see he is owning it up. He's associating himself with it. So he says, we ran as the train moved forwards. We ran behind the backs of the houses, moved from the back of the houses. It crossed the streets of the blinding, and it saw the blinding windscreens, and smelt the fish dock. The train passed through the fish dock, and then the sense of smell is involved. Through the open windows, the smell of the fish would come from the dock, and thence the river's level drifting breadth began, where sky and Lincolnshire and water meet. And in these lines, that sense of harmony and association that he initiated with the word we, it culminates in these last lines when he says, the river drifting beneath. This train was maybe passing on a bridge, and he could see the river moving underneath. And he says, and it was moving where the sky would meet the water, but he says the sky would meet Lincolnshire and water. They would all become one. They would all meet. So he's looking at the far distance. He sees the sky uniting with water, meeting with water in that country, Lincolnshire, countryside, Lincolnshire. So he's creating this image of unity or continuity between the sky, the city, and water. And this is the central image of the poem, the form of an unfolding movement which connects distinct locations and points of time. The idea is complex, but you need to understand it, because this is the central motive of the poem. So is this image that there is that as the train moves forwards, new images are unfolded. because the poet is going to describe to you the different scenes that he's going to witness, that he's going to see. But he says, yet those disjointed images, those separate images, they are all connected. They're all, although they take place in distinct locations, they take place in different locations and in different points of time, but they are all linked, they are all interconnected, and there is a continuity. It is that again, that sense of time that was so unique to these postmodernist writers or poets, that all time is becomes one. They do not differentiate. They do not make sharp distinctions between time, between the past or the present, but all is one, and there's a sense of continuity in time, and it gives this image of wholeness, and it gives an image of completeness. And this same concept we also saw in the previous poem that we discussed in the previous lecture, how the different images in different stanzas that he evokes when he's talking about those statues, when he's talking about that monument, but then he says they're all linked, although it has survived over different times, but it is the message is one, the picture is one. So this is once again a central motive of this poem also. In the next stanza he says, all afternoon, through the tall heat that slept for miles island, a slow and stopping curve southwards we kept. Wide farms went by, short shadowed cattle, and canals with floating of industrial froth. You see the slow moving prose or slow moving rhythm of the lines. All afternoon, through the tall heat that slept for miles island, a slow and stopping curve southwards we kept. So he is using alliteration, the slow and stopping curve southwards. So these repetitions of sounds also give it the slow, harmonious quality. And this is what I have described here as the easy movement of the lines. He says, so the train moved all afternoon. It moved through different scenes, through the tall heat that slept for miles island. He said they passed through motionless islands, motionless places where there was no life. A slow and stopping curve southwards we kept, and it kept moving in a certain direction, and where they passed by wide farms and the short shadowed cattle. He saw cattle also, and he saw canals which were floatings of industrial froth. Once again we see the ugliness disturbing the beauty of the pastoral scene. If you recall the previous poem, there also he talked about the pollution caused by the industrialization, the air being polluted, and how it was affecting the beauty of the statues. Here once again the peace and the beauty is disturbed by the industrial waste. So he says the canals are floating with the industrial waste. So this is a picture, this is a peaceful description of the pastoral landscape. The landscape, pastoral refers to the farmhouses, the cattles. So this is a description that he gives us, a peaceful, quiet, beautiful scenery, pastoral scenery, but which is marred, which is made ugly by the industrialization. In the same stanza, in the next lines, he says, a hothouse flashed uniquely, hedges dipped and rose, and now and then a smell of grass displaced the reek of buttoned carriage cloth, until the next town, new and nondescript, approached with acres of dismantled cars. He says, a hothouse flashed uniquely. A hothouse is a kind of a greenhouse. They quickly, he says, they passed by this hothouse. The hedges, he saw hedges dipping and rising at places. the hedges being cut in different shapes, or hedges as they came close, rising or appearing taller, or as the train moved away from them, being shorter. So he says they saw hedges, and now and then he says the smell of grass. As the windows were open, sometimes when they would pass by these green pastures, the fresh smell of grass would enter the train. But he says it would displace the reek of buttoned carriage cloth. So once again he shows the contrast. The contrast here is between the smell of grass and the reek. Reek is a bad smell. The reek of the carriage seats, the hot carriage seats which are reeking due to heat. They must they must be leather bound. Mostly carriage seats are, or the carriage cloth is reeking of because of the heat, maybe. So he says the smell of grass, it displaced the reek of the carriage cloth until they reached the next town, and that smell was gone, and it was replaced by some other scene. And the new scene, the new town, which was more dull and which had no interesting activity going on. So he is just describing to you how, as the train is moving forward, how as the train is moving towards London, how the shifts or the scenes they shift as the train embarks on its journey. Approached with acres of dismantled cars. He says until they reach the next town, which was new, which was not pastoral, which is not a small town, but it was dull or insipid, and when they approached it, it had acres of dismantled cars. And there were lots of discarded cars that they saw. Maybe it was a kind of a workshop where the cars were dismantled. After the second stanza, in which he describes the changing, shifting scenes while he is southward borne on the train towards London, he comes to the third stanza. And here he is going to introduce the sense of hearing. He says, at first, I didn't notice what a noise the weddings made, each station that we stopped at. The sun destroys the interest of what's happening in the shade, and down the long, cool platforms whoops and skulls. Now he's starting casually. Look at the conversational style in which the poem is written. He says, at first I didn't notice what the noise the weddings made. Now this is an everyday statement. This is a statement that either you or I may even make when we are talking about a similar occurrence. So it is this casual tone, it is this conversational style, which is again peculiar to Larkin. He says, at first I did not notice what a noise the weddings made. Now he's coming to the main theme of the poem. He's coming to the wedding parties, the wedding event of that day, special about that day. He says, no, I never noticed that the wedding parties made any noise, that the weddings made each station that we stopped at. So now he says that the stations, each station that their train would stop at, there would be the noise that would come from the open windows of this train of these wedding parties upon the station or the platform of the station. Then he makes an interesting remark. He says the sun destroys the interest of what's happening in the shade. Maybe it is the glare of the sun that he's talking about, because the sunlight was, it is in the middle of the afternoon, and this glare of the sunlight is so much, so strong, so powerful that he cannot see what is taking place in the shade. Sometimes when we have been out in the sun and we come inside a room, we cannot see clearly enough. Everything appears dark to us. In the same way, he says, the sun destroys the interest of what is happening in the shade. So after the journey in the sunlight, in the bright sunlight, in the bright afternoon sunlight, when the train would reach the station, when the train would come to the shaded area of the station, the platform, he says, the eyes would not be able to discern what is happening, to see easily what is happening on the platform of the station. And then he makes another interesting remark. He says, and down the long, cool platforms. Again, the long, cool platform, cool. He's contrasting this coolness of the platforms with the heat of the afternoon sun and with the heat felt inside the train. He says, and in these long, cool platforms, whoops and skulls. Whoops are again the cries of joy and excitement. Remember that he here is talking about the sense of hearing, and skulls are again the shrilly sounds. So he says these whoops, that these cries and joys of excitements, these shrill sounds, they could be heard on the platform, I took for porters larking with the mails. Since the poet says he could not clearly, distinctly see who was on the platform and what was going on the platform, but he could only hear the sound coming from the platform, and from these whoops and skulls, from these noises of joy coming and reaching from the platform and reaching his ears through the open windows. He says, I thought maybe these were porters. These were porters larking, meaning having fun with the mails. So these were the porters who were talking happily with each other, and they were bringing the stuff to the train. And I went on reading and went on reading. He says, so I did not pay attention. So initially he said, when the train would stop at these cool platforms, and because my light had not gotten used to the darkness of the platform, and I could not see clearly who these people were on the platform and who from where these noises were coming from, which I understood to be the noises of the porters. He says, I did not pay attention, and I went on reading my book. Once we started, though, we passed them, grinning and pomaded girls in parodies of fashion. See, so he didn't notice on that first platform when the train stopped who embarked, who came upon the train. But he says once the train started once again and they came out into the sunlight, he says, we passed them. I saw those people on the platform, grinning and pomaded girls in parodies of fashion, heels and veils, all posed irresolutely watching us go. And who does he say? He says he sees girls painted and all dressed up and made up, wearing heavy makeup. He uses the word pomade for them. Pomade is a greasy substance that is used to make hairstyle. It's like hair gel or a spray. So laughing girls dressed in the newest fashion and with highly stylized hair, in parodies of fashion, who were ordinary girls belonging to the middle class, who were copying the fashion, the latest fashion of the elites, wearing heels and veils, and all posed irresolutely, watching us go. And as the train had begun to move out of the platform, these girls were waving, saying goodbye to whoever they had come here to depart. So he then understood, when he watched this scene, that maybe they had come to see off a couple, to see, so this was a wedding party which had come to the station to see the wedding couple off on the train. In the next stanza, the poet says, as if out on the end of an event, waving goodbye to something that survived it. Struck, I leant more promptly out next time, more curiously, and saw it all again in different terms. Now the poet tells us that he became enthusiastic, he became interested, and he wanted to see exactly how it happened and what was happening out on these platforms. Because he says, as if out on the end of an event, waving goodbye to something that survived it. This event is a wedding event. He says these girls standing on the platform, they were waving as if at the end of an event, so saying goodbye to the couple, delighted couple, which had just come on the train and had started its journey with the poet on the train. Struck I leant, so the poet uses the word struck. He says, I was now struck. My imagination was piqued. My curiosity was alerted. So I leant. He leant out of the window. And he says, and I was more careful now to look out for the next stop. And I was more curious to find out how it all happens, how these wedding parties, they say goodbye to the departing couple. And when the train then stops at the next station, the poet is able to see the different people that have come to say goodbye to the wedding couple, and he's able to see so many different kinds of people that are part of that wedding party. He says the fathers with broad belts under their suits and seamy foreheads, mothers loud and fat, and uncles shouting smut, and then the perms, the nylon gloves and jewelry substitutes, the lemons, mauves and olive ochres that. So he's describing to you those different people who are part of the wedding party and who've come to see off the wedding couple. There are fathers, he says, wearing broad belts, dressed up properly for the occasion, wearing broad belts under their suits, with the seamy foreheads, seamy suggesting the heat. So he says that their foreheads were shining. Now mothers loud and fat. And he says he could hear the fat mothers, their loud gossip, their loud talk. There were uncles as part of the wedding party, in this particular wedding party that he was witnessing. And there was an uncle who was shouting smut, meaning obscenity, who was talking loudly. And then the perms, again he's referring to the hairstyles, the fashionable, the new fashion amongst the ladies, the permanent wave that was in vogue at that time, he says, the nylon gloves that the ladies were wearing to protect their hands from the heat or the sunlight, and the jewelry substitutes. And he says, or anything that they were wearing as substitute to the jewelry, maybe flowers or something else. The lemons, these were the lemons, the mauves, the olive ochres. And he says they were different shapes, the jewelry of lemons, of mauves, and olive ochres. So these are the colors for the yellow shades. They were shades of yellow. They were shades of mauves. Olive ochres, again, is the orange-yellow color. There was this shade that marked off the girls unreally from the rest. So their bright colors, the bright colors of the dresses of the girls mark them off. Yes, from cafes and banquet halls, from up yards and bunting dressed coach party annexes, the wedding days were coming to an end. Then he's describing in these lines how each wedding party is like any other wedding party that was taking place that day. He says, yes, from cafes and banquet halls up yards. On that, he now remembers that on this special Saturday, all the banquet halls, the marriage halls, and all the cafes in short distances from each other, they're all occupied, and they're all full of the wedding parties. And bunting dressed coach party annexes. And bunting is again is a reference to the decoration. It's normally the triangular flags that we use to decorate the ceilings of our houses or the streets. So he says this, the coaches are also decorated with bunting, and they are dressed with bunting. So these parties, he's now imagining this scene. It is not what he's actually witnessing. He saw these people as part of the wedding party on the platform, and he described them to you. Now he's imagining, you know, how the streets, how the banquet halls, and how the cafes would all be decorated, and would all be looking graceful and elegant due to the weddings. The wedding days were coming to end, and he says, so this was the time of the day when the weddings take place. And as the day comes to an end, he says the wedding would also come to an end. So this was a special day where weddings were mostly held. And then he says, all down the line, fresh couples climbed abroad. So he says, as the train stopped at different stations, these new couples would come aboard this train. The rest stood round. The last confetti and advice were thrown. Just as we moved, each face seemed to define just what it saw departing. Children frowned at something dull fathers had never known. Now all down the line, fresh couples climbed abroad. The rest stood around. Naturally, the rest of the wedding party or the people had only come to see them off. So the couple would climb aboard the train, and the rest would stay around on the platform, waving their hands and seeing them off. The last confetti and advice were thrown, and as the couple mounted on the train, they would, and as the train left the platform, these groups of people, this group of people, he says, they would throw confetti. These are the streamers of paper. He said they would throw the confetti, and they throw their last words or advices at the couples. And as we moved, each face seemed to define just what it saw departing. And the exquisite thing is that the poet says, because he could look at the faces of these people left back on the platform and not the couples or who had come abroad the train. He could see the individual faces of these people standing on the platform, and he says each face had a different look from the other, and that different look defined or the experience of that individual. So he says every face could define what it saw departing, what this departing meant to each one of them. And then it gives you the description that there was frown on the faces of children. Children frowned at something dull. Now that the wedding was over, the children were frowning, or maybe they were tired, he says. They found it dull and boring. So this expression on the children's faces talked about their feelings, their emotions, or what they were feeling inside. And he says, fathers had never known success so huge and wholly farcical. Farcical is absurd and ridiculous, he says. And on the fathers' faces, the look was as if it was all absurd, it was all ridiculous. There was no happiness that they were part of the wedding party. The women shared the secret like a happy funeral. But he says the women were different. Their faces showed as if they all shared the same secret. They all seemed to have some kind of secret in their hearts. But the poet describes that secret like a happy funeral. Again, we have this oxymoron, but there's a paradox here, because what he wants to say is that the happy moment of wedding becomes turns into a funeral later on, turns into a sad event later on, because they have been through the experience. So it becomes a happy funeral for them. It's a funeral because it has no joy in it. It's happy because they are protected, they feel secured, and this was what they always wanted. They had fulfilled their dreams. So their feelings of the women are a mixture of the two, that of the happiness and that of sadness. They are happy for the wedding couple. They are happy that the wedding has taken place. But at the same time there is sadness. There is sadness because maybe because of the sense of separation is there, or also because maybe they know that the weddings normally end in disappointments. This is the cynicism and the skepticism of the poet that is apparent here. And the girls, he says, while girls gripping their handbags tighter stared at a religious wounding. And look at the sacredness with which the girls were witnessing. He says that on the girls' faces were wrapped with emotions. Gripping their handbags tighter, they were full of emotions, stared at a religious wounding. And they were looking at the couple in a sacred manner. The poet uses the word religious wounding. And so sacred did the whole thing seem to them, so sacred and happy did the wedding appear to them, that it wounded their hearts, that they were not the ones who were getting married. So there is a religious wounding that is involved here. Free at last and loaded with the sum of all they saw, we hurried towards London, shuffling gouts of steam. Now fields were building plots and poplars cast long shadows over major roads, and for some 50 minutes that in time would seem. He says free at last, and when the train was now free to move on, it was freed of these people on the platform, he says, and it moved on, loaded with the sum of all they saw. The poet is talking about himself. He was now, he had the memory of the look and the faces of the people. He was loaded with the memory. We, this phrase, again this use of we here is special, it is important, because he's again associated himself. He's not dissociating himself from the train, from the journey. He says, he describes it as he's part of it. He says we, and the him and the train, it hurried towards London, shuffling gouts of steam. And then he describes further scenes that the train passes through. Fields were building plots. There were fields where the plots were being built, and there were poplar trees which cast long shadows over the major roads. And for some 50 minutes, and in time would seem, the next stanza, just long enough to settle hats and say, I nearly died. A dozen marriages got underway. So the previous stanza's last line is connected with the first line of the next stanza. This is the technique of continuity. He says, when the train moved for some 50 minutes, and that in that 50 minutes time, he says, and that in time would seem just long enough to settle hats and say, I nearly died. A dozen marriages got underway. So he says, in that narrow time, in those 50 minutes, he witnessed almost a dozen marriages. A dozen marriages got underway. He says, this is a time which is not long enough even to settle hats, or to say something like, I nearly died. 50 minutes, he says, is not a long enough time to express our emotions or to get our things done, as small or minor as settling hats, settling the bet on hats, or buying or selecting a hat. He says, as 50 minutes is not a long time, but he says in that short time, on that day, a dozen marriages got underway. This we can take as a mild social satire, because it shows how Larkin appears to be making fun of the whole exercise of weddings. But it also displays their humanity, which is shared with the poet. They become we in the collective hurrying act. So at one time he's talking about, he's presenting a satire to us. He's making fun of this practice of a wedding, or this practice of weddings taking place on a single day. But at the other side of the picture, we see the whole description as a description in strengthening human relationships. Because as I mentioned earlier on, the word they is changed into we, as he describes that the train's journey continues from the last platform. So he does not dissociate himself from these group of peoples. He uses the word we for them. So there is this collective sense of responsibility. Then in the next few lines of the stanza, the poet says, they watched the landscape, sitting side by side. An Odeon went past, a cooling tower, and someone running up to bowl, and none thought of the others they would never meet. Now, an interesting shift takes place once again. From we, it becomes they again. He says, they watched the landscape, sitting side by side. So he's now describing the couples, and he's dissociating himself from them as if they are repugnant, as if he cannot associate with them, as if being wedded is not a good feeling. So he dissociates himself from the couples. He says they watched the landscape. First it was he, for which he uses the pronoun we. When he talks about this train speeding away, he's talking about, he uses we to talk about the journey, talk about the movement. But now he's dissociating himself from the couples. He says they watched the landscape, sitting side by side. An Odeon went past. It is ironic here once again, an Odeon is like a cinema. It was one of a special chain of British cinemas, and it is significant here because it reinforces the theme of detachment. The theme of detachment and association that runs through the poem. So sometimes the poet detaches himself from the whole scene, but then we see he associates himself with the scene. Then again he detaches himself, then he again associates himself. So this theme runs through the whole poem. So the speaker here, Vinny, is watching the couple, and as he watched the landscape earlier also, now he's talking as if the couples are watching the landscape. So there is a sense of detachment, and we know that cinema is also built for watching. So it's a strange atmosphere that he creates. An Odeon went past, the train went past the Odeon, a cooling tower, and someone running up to bowl. Bowl is a it's a cup used for drinking water. And none thought of the others they would never meet. Says, but none of the couples, none of them thought, they were so engrossed in looking at the scene or amongst themselves, they did not think about the people whom they would never meet, whom they may never meet again, whom they may never see again, or how their lives would all contain this hour. He says, and they're not bothered how the whole life that they have before them now, how it will interpret this particular time, this particular hour, how it's going to affect it. Again, there is the hidden meaning here is the pessimism, the skepticism of the poet. He seems to imply here that what the couple feels at the start of the wedding or on the first day of the wedding is totally different from how it feels later on in the later days to come. So he says they cannot as yet measure this hour, this moment, against the later moments. I thought of London spread out in the sun, its postal districts packed like squares of wheat. He is now imagining here, the train is about to reach London, he says, and he started imagining London. He says, I imagine London spread out in the sun, its postal districts packed like squares of wheat. He's describing the industrial London, the industrial city of London, packed, and he describes it with like squares of wheat, where buildings are so close to each other that he says, he compares them to the squares of wheat, the squares of wheat that are on the field after the farmers have collected them and bound them together. But this line is significant because it is similar to the opening line of Auden's famous poem, As I Walked Out One Evening, and I've given the reference to you. I'll read out these lines and you can see how similar they are. The Auden's lines say, "As I walked out one evening, walking down Bristol Street, the crowds upon the pavement were fields of harvest wheat." Now, Auden is describing the crowds as fields of harvest wheat. And here, Larkin is describing these districts as the squares of wheat. Then we come to the last stanza. And he says, "There we were aimed." Again, you see he uses we. So from dissociation, from estrangement, once again he comes to association. He says, "We were all going towards that destiny, that city. And as we raced across bright knots of rail, past standing Pullmans, walls of blackened moss," he says, as the train raced across, he says it went across the bright knots of rail. Now it is entering the suburbs of London. So he's describing to you the industrial town, city. He says there were knots of rail, bright knots of rail, the standing Pullmans, the walls of blackened moss. They passed through the destruction caused by the industrialization. He talks about the blackened moss. He says, "Came close and it was nearly done, this frail traveling coincidence." He says, "We came very close to the city and we almost reached London. We almost reached the city." And he describes the end of the journey as this frail traveling coincidence. So he describes the whole that he's just described to you with this phrase, this frail traveling coincidence. In Italian, the coincidenza is a transfer station in railroad travel. It is the transfer station basically where the railroads are changed, okay, and the trains can travel in different directions. So like both frail and traveling, it may just be a way of naming the brief encounter that the poem stages. So he says we reached that point. The train eventually reached that point. Before it entered London, it reached that traveling coincidence, that point from where, you know, the railroads go in different direction. It was a transfer station. He says this imagery, this metaphor, it is the way of describing the whole poem, because it may be used to describe this brief encounter of the poem and between the speaker and those he has observed. So he describes it as a coincidence, because he says just like his journey is nearly done, in the same way his poem is also nearly done. So we can read the above the previous line in both ways also. He says we came close. He may mean we have come close to London, or I have come close to the end of the poem, and it was nearly done. And the journey is nearly done, as well as his account of the journey in his poem, which is nearly done. And this frail traveling coincidence, and this the traveling has come to an end because they have reached this transfer station. But here this traveling coincidence may also seem to refer to his encounter, to his brief encounter, which he describes as frail and coincidence, by chance, as if coincidence also means by chance, and frail this weak. So this brief, weak, frail link or encounter that he had with the changing scenes, with the people on the platform, he said that has also come to an end. And what it held stood ready to be loosed with all the power that being changed can give. And when he describes it as a traveling coincidence, he says, and it changed all that it held, stood ready to be loosed with all the power that being changed can give. He says, but the journey as it has come to the close, and from what he has seen, he says, now the train, on the literal level, the train, he says, is now ready, is now on a changed, is in a change environment. It now enters the city of London. So he says the scene has changed now, the journey has ended. And on the metaphoric level, he's talking about the change in his feelings. He's talking about the change in his feelings. He's driving at that ambivalence. He's driving at that ambivalent feeling that is that is so much part of Larkin's poetry. And we shall see that after he talks about this change, in the last few lines, he's going to give out his ambivalent attitude plainly and explicitly. He says, "We slowed again, and as the Titan brakes took hold, there swelled a sense of falling, like an arrow shower sent out of sight, somewhere becoming rain." Now he's using a simile here. He's using the simile of someone shooting the arrow, and that someone naturally which we associate with the classical myth is the Cupid, the god of love, Cupid, shooting the arrows. So he is comparing the whole experience, or we can say he's comparing the whole wedding scene, the wedding party, to the shooting of an arrow. He says, "And as the Titan brakes took hold, there swelled a sense of falling." And the literal meaning of these lines is that as the brakes were pulled, the brakes of the train were pulled, naturally the bodies lurch forward. There is a movement forward when the brakes are pulled. So he may be referring to that actual happening. So because it is described with the sense of falling. But he's also when he talks about the sense of falling, he's also talking about that dreamy state that he was in as he watched those wedding parties, as he watched those people dressed up for the wedding, and as he looked and observed the couples, he says, he felt a sense of falling. And then he uses that simile. He says, "Like an arrow shower sent out of sight, somewhere becoming rain." He says, "I experienced that sense of disappointment come over me, like the arrow shower, the showers of arrow." The showers of arrow he's talking about. He's not talking about one single arrow. He says, as arrows, they are sent out of sight, they are thrown out of sight, and wherever they land, they become rain. They rain down upon the other side. They rain down upon the enemy. So, but with this image, with this simile, he's showing his sense of disappointment. He's showing how at the end of the journey, which you can take as a kind of a spiritual journey, how at the end of this journey he feels disappointed. This disappointment we can associate with his idea of marriage, with the idea of wedding. That he says that the disappointment of these couples will also be the happiness of these couples will also be short-lived, and there will soon be disappointment in their lives. So basic idea is that of idea of marriage turning into disappointment, and he tries to show it through the shower of the arrows turning into rain when they fall elsewhere. So this is the wave of disappointment that overcomes the poet at the end of the poem. And he balances this with the idea of life and fertility, because rain is a symbol of life and fertility. We know that. So there may also be this hidden meaning of fertility, of reproduction, of more of children being born, and of responsibilities and of problems. So marriage ending in disappointments. So the idea here is how the whole practice or the whole event of marriage is a disappointing event. So this was the text of the poem. Now let's see what Larkin himself has to say about the poem. Larkin says, Whit Saturday is traditionally a good day for getting married in the Anglican tradition. So a lot of people got on the train to London for their honeymoons, as not many people had cars. So these people, he may explain to us that these couples were going to London for their honeymoons. There were 6 stations between Hull and London, and there was a sense of gathering emotional momentum. So this is an important phrase. Larkin himself describes to you that the train stops 6 times between Hull and London. So 6 times he was able to see these wedding parties on the platform, and the couples coming onto this train. So, but he says that there was a sense of gathering emotional momentum, and as the train sped, as the train gained momentum and it moved forward, he says his emotional was also gaining and gathering momentum. Every time you stopped, fresh emotion climbed aboard. He's talking about the couples. So he says emotions were arousing. There were high emotions everywhere that were part of the wedding, and especially the emotions of the couples. Between Peterborough and London, the whole thing felt like a bullet. All this fresh open life, and I have never forgotten it. So this vitality, this energy, because he uses the word bullet, and this freshness, he says, was something that mesmerized him, was something that captivated him, and he could never forget it. After this, let us now look at the poem once again and see what themes emerge from it, and then we will also see how the form of the poem is tackled. Now, first of all, traditionally, Whit Saturday was regarded as an auspicious day for a wedding, and it was a popular choice among the British working classes. As in Larkin's own words, these people would go to these main cities like London for their honeymoons. So this was what was happening. Moreover, a wedding is an expression of a loving commitment, bringing with it the prospect of future happiness and expectation of a new life. So it were these emotions that he saw on the faces of the couples, or the emotions that he saw on the faces of people on the platform, that actually struck the poet, and that made him observe the scene carefully and with keen interest. So it was these expectations, the happiness, and the prospects of future, of happy future, that have to do with wedding parties, that mesmerized the poet. Larkin appeals to readers' sense of touch, smell, and sight, and we have seen how the poem is a sensuous poem. It uses these 3 senses. There is a real paradox between the reality presented by the landscape and the ideals represented by the couples and the final. This is one critical theme of the poem. There is a reality which is represented by the landscape, because we see that in the first few stanzas, Larkin is describing to us the nature, the changing scenes, the landscape, and then he comes upon the wedding scenes on the platform, and he describes those wedding scenes to us, those people to us, those wedding parties. So there is this contrast between the reality of the landscape and the ideals, the feelings and emotions depicted on the faces of the people or shown on the faces of the couples. He says there is a paradox. There's a conflict between the two. One is real, the other the poet thinks is unreal because it is temporary. Larkin longs for the abstracts of romance and perfect love, but he sees around him the oncoming city. So this may be another theme for the poem, another interpretation for the poem, that he was longing for the abstraction of romance and perfect love. And that was why when he saw those wedding parties, he became engrossed in them. He liked to look at the faces and read the faces of the couples. He liked to see them in love with each other. But the depressing landscape, the depressing countryside, that destroys his mood also. The climax at the end seems to work against the surface cynicism of Larkin's tone, as he experiences a tug for something more due to the mesmerizing occasion he witnesses. Now, this is another interpretation of the last lines that we've just discussed. According to this reading, the last lines or the climax, it is not the cynicism of Larkin that comes out through those lines. He says that he is experiencing a tug for something more due to the mesmerizing occasion. That Larkin, in fact, in the last lines, when he's talking about the shooting arrows turning into rain elsewhere, what he's trying to say is that he expects more happiness from life. He wishes for more happiness for these wedded couple. So he wants more warmth from the loved ones. So because he's just experienced an emotional scene, and he himself maybe feeling the emotional upheaval, so he expects more. So the apparent cynicism of the last lines actually may not be cynicism, and it may be an actual desire for lasting happiness and lasting peace. So this is another interpretation to the reading of his poem. And again, as is the case with this symbolic poems or symbolic literature, you can take up any interpretation that you feel comfortable with. And now a brief comment on the form of the poem. I did talk about it in the beginning, but as you can see, I have this first stanza completely before you. The first stanza consists of 10 lines, as each stanza does. All 8 stanzas are 10 lines each. And this should remind you of Keats's odes. All odes, the summer odes that Keats wrote, they were 10-lined stanzas. They were also written in iambic pentameter. And he also evoked sharp imagery, contrasting images. Paradoxes and oxymorons were also there. There were complications and ambiguities and contrasts. So we see here Larkin taking from Keats a lot. The rhyme scheme is also significant. You see it is A-B, A-B, C-D-E, C-D-E. And this is a rhyme scheme typical of a sonnet. Partially, but typical of a sonnet. A sonnet consists of 2 quatrains and then 2 tercets. But here you have 1 quatrain and 2 tercets. So it's partially a sonnet. It's partially a sonnet. So he takes the strict sonnet form and uses it throughout the poem in each stanza. But yet we see it still allows him to to have the flexibility of verse, because he still uses the technique of enjambment. The last line of the first stanza does not end with the first stanza, but it may continue in the second stanza. So there is flexibility, but there is still a unity that is given by this strict structure of the poem. The poem's rhyming structure is a sort of shortened sonnet. As I've just told you, the quatrain is Shakespearean in nature, and the sestet is Petrarchan. Larkin employs technique which was used by Keats in his odes. There is the same kind of imagery of abundance, yet a sense of bitter reality. You can also discuss that if you want to, when you're analyzing the poem, because Larkin does use the imagery of abundance throughout the poem, and contrasts it then with the sense of this bitter reality that sometimes he talks about the effects of industrializations. Sometimes he's talking about the temporariness of feelings of love, because when it shows us the glimpses of the different people standing on the platform, we see that only the girls are filled, faces show those emotions of true happiness, and their own sense of loss for not being one of them. But yet we see the father's face have, there's a gloomy look about it. The mothers are also partially sad, partially happy. So he does tell us that there is, weddings are not all about happiness. There is a sadness hidden beneath. The sensual imagery and the musical phrasing create at the same time a real and surreal impression. That is again something that is also part of Keats's odes. So with this we come to the end of this poem by Larkin. These were the two representative poems of Larkin which I've discussed with you in the course. And both the poems, as you can see, are written in the symbolist tradition, and both the poems are representative of him because in the poems he explores all the different techniques and styles and forms and themes that he is so well known for. So it should give you an idea of the kind of poetry that Larkin composed. In most of his poetry we shall see there are the same ideas, there is the same attitude, and there is the same tone, but the most prominent feature of his poetry is the colloquial tone, is the everyday language that he employs, yet at the same time there is alongside this flexibility in diction and in this flexibility in the format of the lines, there is a strict adherence to a structure, there is a strict adherence to a form, and it is this harmony, it is this that creates a harmony in the poem, and it gives a total harmonious effect to the poem. And this is why he's such a great 20th century poet. And then I also explained to you how the content and how the form, they are also related, they are also interlinked, and this is linked to Larkin's own concept of the continuity of time. So he doesn't believe in dissociations like all postmodernists. There are links and the interconnectedness and associations of ideas, there are merging of themes. So there is this interconnectedness between the themes or the content and the form or the structure of the poem. Because as you see, the theme or if the tone or the theme is sad, it is shown in the structure of the poem. It is shown through certain devices that he employs, through the alliteration, or the softness is implied through the repetition of certain sounds. So there is a harmony. There is a complete overall harmonized effect that is achieved through his poems. So these are the characteristic features of Larkin's poetry, and with this I come to the close of this lecture. In the next lecture we're going to look at another modern poet, and we're going to see another 20th century poet, and we shall see how he also follows the symbolist tradition, but we would like to see how he's distinguished from Larkin or from Yeats. So I shall meet you again in the next lecture. Till then, goodbye and thank you very much.